Boyfriend's family tried to humiliate her, but she walked out with the whole room behind her. Lucky break, isn't it? That's what they said, right before the applause even stopped. That's what they whispered when Zuri Adebayo stepped off the stage. The top of her class, years of sacrifice distilled into a single title, valedictorian. But none of that seemed to matter to the Morrow family. Because no matter how hard she worked, how many nights she bled through textbooks and court cases, all they could see was skin. All they could see was difference. And this day, the day she should have been celebrated, became the day they tried to shrink her. What they didn't know is Zuri had been building her fire for this very moment. And before the sun would set on that golden afternoon, she'd light up the lies they told behind their champagne smiles. Welcome to Cracks of Light, where true stories of quiet strength and stunning resolve rise from beneath the surface. If this story moves you, or if you've ever been the one overlooked until you weren't, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment to tell us where you're watching from. Now let's begin. The quad at the University of Chicago buzzed with a kind of heat that had nothing to do with the sun. Navy gowns drifted across green lawns like waves, tassels bouncing, laughter rising above the rustle of programs and camera shutters. But Zuri Adebayo stood apart. Not because she wasn't celebrating, but because celebration always came at a cost. Her robe was pressed, her hair pulled into a high bun that crowned her like a monument, and under it all, a plum silk dress that fit like a declaration. At 26, she wasn't just graduating, she was dominating. First in her class, full-ride scholarship, chosen to speak on behalf of the entire law program. A walking answer to every doubt ever hurled her way. And yet, there they were, just a few feet away, standing perfectly poised in designer restraint. The Morrow family. Kale's family. Her boyfriend's family. The one she'd only seen in photos. Vivian Morrow, all beige silk and diamond restraint. Gerard Morrow, tailored silence. Camille, older sister, eyes like mirrors that only reflect status. They weren't cruel, not openly. That's the trick. They didn't need to raise their voices or say anything direct. All it took was a glance, a pause, the way Vivian said, "That's quite a bold dress," like it was an insult tucked inside a compliment. Or the way Camille lingered on the word fortunate when she asked about Zuri's scholarship, as if Zuri's intellect were a lottery win instead of hard-earned. And Gerard, he just looked at her like an investment that didn't meet the terms. Zuri smiled through it, her voice calm, her back straight. But she felt the heat rising, the kind that doesn't show on skin but tightens in the chest. Kale stood beside her, warm, supportive, but a step behind. Always a step behind when it counted. "Ignore them," he murmured. "They'll come around." But Zuri knew better. These weren't people who came around. They were the kind who watched you rise just to wonder how high you'd go before you fell. What they didn't understand, what they'd never see coming, was that Zuri had no plans to fall. This was her day, but it was also a test. And the real commencement hadn't even started yet. The rooftop restaurant glittered with warm light and cold judgment. Beneath the chandelier's soft glow, the clink of crystal and the low murmur of polite conversation disguised the tension that curled under every word. Zuri sat at the table like a sculpture, elegant, composed, wrapped in plum silk and unspoken restraint. Her bun, still pristine, was not just a hairstyle, it was armor. Across from her sat Vivian Morrow, swirling her Chardonnay like she was auditioning for grace. Beside her, Gerard carved into his steak as if it owed him something. Camille, eyes glued to her phone, looked up only to deliver smirks that sliced. Tuan Min, Kale, sat beside Zuri, his hand lightly brushing hers under the table, a gesture of support that felt more like delay. "Zuri," Vivian began, her voice honeyed but edged. "Your speech earlier was spirited, quite moving. You must have come from a very vibrant community." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Vibrant, hung in the air like the smell of something rotting behind fresh flowers. Zuri placed her fork down slowly. "I grew up in Evanston. My parents worked hard, and we were raised on values that don't fade under pressure." Her tone was calm, even, not defensive, controlled. But inside, the match was struck. Camille laughed. light and sharp. Evanston, right? That's cute. And you ended up here, valedictorian? That's unexpected. She dragged out the last word like it had to be pried from her teeth. I guess that full scholarship really paid off. The implication was clear. Zuri didn't earn her seat. She was placed there by diversity policy, by luck, by some charity algorithm. Zuri took a breath. Scholarships go to the best candidates. I was prepared. Her eyes met Camille's squarely. Fortune favors the qualified. She smiled, but her grip on a napkin in her lap was white-knuckled. Gerard chimed in, eyes still on his plate. And you want to go into public interest law, correct? Noble work, but not exactly lucrative. Cale has certain standards to maintain. You understand. It wasn't a question. It was a quiet execution. Zuri's voice remained still, but the edge in it was sharpening. I fight for those who don't have a voice. That's a life I chose, and Cale respects it. She glanced sideways at him, just a flicker, then back at Gerard. Vivian smiled. Of course. It must be exhausting, though, all those heavy issues. So intense. It's rewarding, Zuri answered before the smile could fully curl. Every case changes someone's life. That's never too intense for me. Camille leaned in, a finger resting lazily against her glass. I mean, that's great, but it's not exactly dinner party material, right? You must see some wild stuff. Zuri's hands didn't move. Her shoulders didn't flinch, but her voice dropped a degree. What I see are people fighting for dignity. That's human. That's real. That belongs at every table. Her gaze held steady, even as Camille's smirk wavered. The table went quiet, just for a moment, long enough for Cale to feel the shift. He sat up straighter. Zuri's work is changing lives. I'm proud of her, he said, finally speaking louder than a whisper. It was too late. Not entirely, but just late enough to leave a bruise. Zuri smiled at him, grateful but exhausted. His support was gentle, but it lacked sharpness. She didn't need gentle. She needed him to name what they were doing. A server refilled water glasses. The clink of ice masked the silence until Vivian struck again. And the scholarship you mentioned earlier, was that part of a diversity initiative? Zuri's spine straightened without moving. It was awarded based on academic excellence. My GPA and test scores were top percentile. Gerard nodded, but it wasn't approval. Impressive. Those programs are generous. Zuri's chest tightened. Generous. As if her presence here was a gift they gave her. Camille tilted her head. But you must always feel pressure to prove yourself, right? I mean, not everyone sees you as valedictorian material. Her eyes dropped from Zuri's face to her skin. The sound of Zuri's fork brushing her plate was nearly inaudible. But it was there. Her silence was cracking. Not breaking, but shifting. She had been through this before. In classrooms where her arguments were questioned before she opened her mouth. In interviews where her name raised brows before her resume even landed. But this was different. This was personal. These were the people tied to the man she loved. And that man, right now, sat beside her with a hand on hers, but no words on his tongue. Vivian raised her glass again. You're clearly ambitious, Zuri. But Cale's future, his legacy, requires a certain kind of alignment. I'm sure you understand. It was soft, almost sweet, like a lullaby made of needles. Zuri met her gaze, eyes unblinking. I understand perfectly. Her voice was low measured. The server returned with creme brulee, but nobody touched it. The knives were already on the table, and they weren't silver. The moment Zuri rose from her seat, the hum of silverware and murmurs dimmed like someone had turned the room's volume down to a whisper. The dining room at Lucille, once buzzing with polite conversation and veiled superiority, felt tight, like the air itself had paused to see what she'd do next. Her heels clicked softly on the polished floor as she stepped toward the center, her posture straight, her bun unwavering, her plum dress catching just enough light to remind the room she didn't come here to fade in. Her voice cut through the tension like a scalpel, quiet, precise, unflinching. I wasn't born into rooms like this, she said. I wasn't taught which fork to use first or how to keep my voice soft enough to not offend. What I was taught, by parents who worked double shifts and by a world that rarely expected more from girls who looked like me, was how to stand when I was expected to shrink. Eyes locked on her, but she didn't flinch. Not when Camille folded her arms. Not when Vivian's lips tightened into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Tonight, some of you saw me speak at graduation, she continued. You clapped, you smiled, you called it inspiring. But later at this table, I was reminded that for some, none of that matters. Not the GPA, not the hours, not the cases I've taken or the lives I've helped protect. Because before any of that, you saw something else. She let that sit, let the weight of it settle like ash. My story is not a charity case. My degree isn't a courtesy title. I am not your diversity success story. I'm a lawyer. I'm a daughter. I'm a woman who belongs here. Not because I was let in, but because I earned it. Every word I speak, every room I enter, every scar I carry has been paid for. There was no applause. Not yet. Only the sound of breath held in rib cages, of gazes darting between family members and guests unsure whether to look away or lean in. And to those of you wondering if I'm too intense, too driven, too passionate to be a part of this family, let me say this. I don't need to be made smaller to fit into your world. That's not love. That's erasure. She turned, met Cale's eyes across the table. And Cale, she said, her voice soft but firm, I don't need saving. But I do need to know if you'll stand beside me when the air gets cold and the voices get quiet. Not just when it's easy. The silence broke like a fault line. Cale stood. No hesitation this time. His chair scraped against marble, loud and certain. Enough, he said, his voice shaking but loud. Zuri's the most extraordinary woman I've ever known. She's brilliant, she's brave. And if you can't respect her, you don't respect me. All eyes turned. Camille's face went pale. Gerard froze mid-reach. Vivian's composure slipped like a mask peeling at the edges. I love her, Cale said, his voice steadier now. And if you think I'm going to let this family push her out with polite smiles and loaded compliments, you don't know me at all. The room didn't erupt, but it shifted, like gravity had changed. Zuri didn't move, didn't blink. She just nodded once, slow and knowing. Her speech wasn't a plea. It was a line drawn in marble and glass and blood. And Cale had finally crossed it, toward her. Zuri had just returned to her seat, the edges of her presence still radiating through the room like aftershock. Cale's words had cracked the surface, but the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was recoil. Vivian's fingers tightened around her wine glass. Camille's mouth twitched like she was trying to reset her expression. Gerard shifted in his seat, but said nothing. Then a voice broke through the tension, not from the table, but from across the room. Ms. Adebayo. The tone was warm, firm, and unmistakably commanding. Every head turned. Standing near the entrance was Professor Elaine Carver, a legend in constitutional law, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, respected enough that even the most arrogant men in the legal field kept quiet when she spoke. "May I borrow you for a moment?" she asked, though it wasn't really a request. Zuri rose, steady. She didn't glance at the Morrows. She didn't need to. Carver approached, but her voice carried just enough for the table to hear. "I've just spoken with the managing partner at Kessler and Lane," she said. "They've been following your work, your clinic cases, your leadership, that speech today. They'd like to offer you a senior associate position, with a clear track to partner." For a second, no one moved. It was like the room itself blinked. Kessler and Lane. Global. Elite. A place where lawyers twice her age would kill for an interview, let alone an offer. Zuri inhaled slowly. "Thank you, Professor. I'm honored." Carver smiled, then looked past her, directly at Vivian Morrow, then Camille, then Gerard. "They see something in her that I wish was obvious to everyone in this room," she said. Calm, direct, measured, the kind of tone that didn't need to raise volume to raise consequences. Vivian's expression faltered. Camille dropped her gaze. Gerard finally looked like someone had reached him, not through argument, but consequence. Zuri sat back down, her movements controlled, her mind racing. Cale's hand reached for hers again, this time not tentative. Firm, proud. "Zuri, that's incredible," he said, his voice full, no hesitation left. "You deserve it. Every bit of it." His words weren't for show. Not now. Now he believed it, because the world had validated what his family refused to see. But Zuri didn't smile for them. Not for the applause, not for the shock, not even for the stunned silence across the table. She sat taller because this wasn't a win she needed to explain. She had been seen, not by the people who doubted her, but by the ones who mattered. And that kind of validation couldn't be undone. Cityscape, 1 month later, Zuri was no longer just a name they whispered across rooms. At Kessler and Lane, she was a rising force, leading case reviews, pitching strategies to partners twice her age, and walking into boardrooms with the kind of clarity that silenced doubt before it formed. Her work spoke louder than any dinner table ever could. But beyond the office, change was unfolding in quieter, more personal ways. Kale had stopped attending the weekly Morrow family dinners. No explanations, no apologies, just absence, a decision that said more than any argument ever could. He'd signed up for a racial equity seminar without telling her, sat through hours of discomfort, took notes, asked questions, didn't pretend to already understand. When she spoke at a legal forum on community housing justice, he sat in the front row, not as her boyfriend, but as someone learning to listen. Camille reached out first. A short text. Can we talk? It wasn't polished. It wasn't performative. At their coffee meeting, she didn't try to excuse what had been said. She owned it. I didn't know what I didn't know, Camille admitted, voice low. But I want to. Zuri didn't rush forgiveness. She laid it out clearly. Grace isn't the same as access. But the door cracked open. A week later, Camille showed up to one of Zuri's panels. Not to be seen, just to hear. Gerard emailed. Formal, precise. He asked to meet and talk through her work. I've been reading about housing discrimination, he wrote. I was wrong. He didn't say more, but he didn't need to. At lunch, he sat across from Zuri and listened, awkward but quiet, absorbing every word like it carried weight. And for once it did. Vivian, though, remained unchanged. A card had arrived after the Lucille dinner, brief and signed. Misunderstanding. That was all it said. No call. No conversation. When Kale visited alone, she barely brought up Zuri. And when she did, it was in passing, like referencing a weather event that had already moved on. Zuri didn't expect transformation. She'd stopped needing it. Vivian had become the symbol of what couldn't be fixed. And that, too, had its place. Zuri and Kale were rebuilding. But this time with clearer boundaries. No more shrinking. No more waiting for someone else to translate her worth. He no longer stood behind her. He walked beside her. And in a world that still measured love by legacy, they were building their own. Zuri Adebayo didn't vanish into success. She became a presence too bold to ignore. At Kessler and Lane, her name carried weight, not because of the firm's prestige, but because of what she brought to the table. Clarity, conviction, and the kind of unapologetic purpose that made even the most seasoned partners take a second look. She fought for tenants, immigrants, workers, and women like herself, those who were always told they had to earn rooms that were never built for them. Her rise wasn't steeped in ego. It was deliberate, grounded. She still answered calls from students, mentored young Black women entering law, spoke on panels not to impress, but to disrupt. And through it all, Kale stood beside her, not as her shield, not as her fixer, but as her partner. He no longer apologized for who his family had been. He proved daily who he was choosing to become. Their relationship wasn't perfect. It was real, built not on avoiding the hard truths, but on confronting them together. Camille's check-ins became consistent. Gerard invited her to speak at a foundation meeting. Vivian remained distant, but her silence now carried less power. Zuri no longer needed their permission to thrive. Her story wasn't about changing them. It was about refusing to be reduced by them. And that is what made her unforgettable. She wasn't chasing a fairy tale ending. She was writing a future on her terms, page by page, case by case, step by step. The girl they once underestimated had become the woman they could no longer look past. Thank you for walking with Zuri through this journey of resistance, love, and earned belonging. If her story moved you, if it reminded you of your own fight or someone you know who refuses to be silenced, we want to hear it. Drop a comment, tell us where you're watching from, and let us know what part of Zuri's journey stayed with you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story so others can feel seen too. Until next time, keep standing, keep speaking, and never let them write your ending for you.